During this video, I'll share how to set up a provider. To begin, navigate to the main menu and click on Setup. Click on Provider, and the Provider list page will open up. The software allows you to have an unlimited number of providers set up in the system, where each provider can have their own specialty and their own individual tax IDs if needed. To modify an existing provider, click on the selection and the provider information screen will open. Otherwise, hit New to add a new entry. On this provider screen, enter the first, middle, and last name. A code is generated based on the last and first name. A lot of reporting in the software is driven by a provider's code, which are essentially the initials of the provider for reporting and navigation purposes. From the Type drop-down, you can select different types of providers, like whether the provider is a chiropractor or assistant physician. If you want to set up different types of equipments that you want to display as a dummy provider, you can also do that. Enter in the other information like gender, address, and contact information, and legal entities. The software allows you to have one provider be available in multiple locations. What that means is, let's say I have one provider and two locations. For example, if there are two locations, one is in San Francisco and the other location in another area. You can say that this provider needs to be available in both locations, or he or she will only need to see patients in one location. Depending upon what is selected as you move on to the scheduler or other parts of the application, the provider information will be available along with legal entities in all the locations set here. When the provider is not working in that location anymore, you can just unselect the location on this screen. Coming to the identity information, enter the federal tax ID, and by default it's essentially the same as the practice's federal tax ID. Next is the individual NPI ID of the provider. You can look up the NPI of the provider by clicking on the NPI registry link. There are cases where you want to set up a separate tax ID or bill the providers using a provider's social security number, or a case where a provider is visiting a practice and this provider wants to use their own tax ID, which you can do in override billing by specifying the appropriate tax ID. The DEA number field is required for prescribing providers. The UPIN number is not really required with the advent of NPI, unless you have a specific payer that requires you to send a legacy ID. In most cases, you do not require a legacy ID, so you can leave this blank. The state license number needs to be completed to be used in your prescriptions and in certain cases of sending claims. On the bottom is the provider's signature screen. You can scan and upload the signature here. The signature is essentially utilized on the clinical side. When the provider completes a note, this signature is embedded into the note. Signature on file is defaulted to yes. Signature date is the date when a signature was on file. This is used when you send claims on paper, and you have to have a signature on file with the payer to send a paper claim without needing to sign it. If you don't know the date, default the date to a historical date preceding the claim. Moving to the right side, the scheduler option. If you have a multi-provider scenario where you only want to bill one provider, but not put it on the scheduler, for example, you have a provider which you want to bill for, but only sees patients outside the facility or does not follow the scheduling, then you can select this box and hide that provider from the appointment scheduler. Superbill template. We have the ability to select a pre-printed superbill that can be printed from the scheduler. You just need to select the appropriate superbill template. If the provider is no longer with the practice, then you can just put an end date. As has been stated in previous videos, there is no physical delete capability once data has been saved. All you would do is put an end date or mark it as inactive, which means that after this date ends, the provider will no longer see patients, but the provider's historical appointments, charges, and clinical records will remain in the system until this date. Going forward, the provider's information will not be available in any of the drop-down lists in the scheduler, the reporting, or the clinical side, so that this provider is considered inactive.